what I'd like to do now is turn to our panel. And I'd like this to be more in the form of a conversation rather than structured remarks. And I'd like you first to start off by expressing your opinion in a few minutes on a couple of questions, if I might. One is, what surprised you and what did not about this report in terms of findings? And secondly, how do you think some of these findings can be used and to address the challenge that we all have now to make sure that this is one that can actually have traction among the decision makers in education. So Sally, can I start with you?
I'm quite geographically challenged, and so I printed off a map, a Google map, to walk here from the station. And the Google map claimed that it would tell me exactly how to get here step by step. But when I printed it off, at the start was use caution, may involve errors or sections not suited for walking. And it got me thinking about, having worked in education for quite a while, about when new studies or policies or pieces of research used to come on my table. And it did feel a little bit like claiming to do something, but then there was so many caveats that actually it didn't really help me get from A to B. But I think this report has really added a huge value to what we know by bringing everything together so comprehensively. So I really just wanted to start off by saying thank you very much for the work that you've done, particularly Birte. I mean, 238 programs, 16 million children, 52 low and middle income countries, and you're still smiling, is fantastic. So thank you. So I just wanted to, really just sort of welcome before we go into the nitty gritty. And of course, with this sort of audience, we're going to pull bits apart, and you know exactly. But I wanted to make sure that that was said at the beginning. In terms of surprises, which was the question, sorry, I will respond now. I mean, for me, very specifically on the school feeding findings was, I think we for many years sort of felt that actually we weren't really sure that had any impact on learning outcomes at all. It was, and actually to have, and the reason why I think this study unpacked that was because it looked at process. So actually, I think, reading the report, it wasn't actually saying all school feeding programs work everywhere, but actually the way that you do this really matters in terms of impact. So that for me was great insight and sort of made me thinking more about that area. I guess that the reinforcement was the work on the pedagogy, the structured pedagogy, the work on cash transfers. But again, I think the report really added value by looking at the process. And that really is helpful for people like me making decisions, funding decisions, etc., and for our advisors in countries. So those were the 2 points I'd pull out. Thanks.
Anything on how this might be used from DFID's point of view in the future?
Or should we come to that after we've given my colleagues a chance to speak?
All right. So on surprises, and again, congratulations. This is a big, this is a huge accomplishment. I would say a couple of things. So. A few years ago, a colleague and I did a process where we reviewed 6 systematic reviews of what works to improve learning. And they had all come out between 2011 and 2013, 6 studies of essentially the same thing. And so, we reviewed that, tried to find what they had in common and where they fell short. And so when I heard of the new 3IE review, I admit I was pretty skeptical because I said, well, do we really need, we had 6 in 2 years. Do we really need more of these systematic reviews? Well, I think the answer for that, and this is where the surprise came to me, as I looked at the list at the end of the 875-page full review, the list of studies included, and I lined it up against the list of studies that were included in any of these 6 other systematic reviews. There were dozens and dozens of studies that had been missed before. Some of those were because this study had a very inclusive strategy, which is wonderful. And then a second, though, is just the explosion of research. So out of the more than 300 studies in that list for this report, more than 50% of them are dated in the last 5 years. And so the short answer is yes, like we do need a new review here. And I think one of the things that points to is that we'll also need another review 3 years from now. So one of the things that I hope can come out of this, that can make this used for producing the next round of evidence, is as we were reviewing these systematic reviews, it was incredibly difficult to find what papers they had drawn on, only one review, Patrick McEwen's work, had actually prepared a database that had their standardized effect sizes readily available for future researchers to build on. And I really hope that this work can come out of that. And so that was one of the big surprises. Was this necessary? And the answer is yes.
Thank you. What interested me in reading it was how might a policymaker interpret this evidence? Because, as Dave said, there's been a huge amount of energy invested in systematic reviews, not just in this topic, but perhaps a little bit less so in terms of what is needed in order to understand the mechanisms by which this kind of evidence can be employed. For example, the very fact that it turns out that a particular intervention is successful across context doesn't mean necessarily that it's the right thing to do in any particular new context. And there needs to be a fuller understanding of the theory of change in relation to any particular school system, which includes the political economy of change in that country, to understand whether or not this particular recommended intervention might work or be suitable, or in fact cause other unwanted consequences. So it's about the judicious understanding of this huge repository really is my main concern. And I think there is a possibility that this review, being so comprehensive, can be overwhelming. It can be either misunderstood or it can be misused at worst. And I think the biggest danger of that is that it forms a part of a kind of heavily empiricist approach, but without a fuller understanding of the theory within which that sits. So, for example, why is it that remedial education is apparently effective in the particular context in India? Now, it may well be that the curriculum is in fact excessively difficult or over-ambitious. So students find it difficult to follow the curriculum, teachers teach at a level which is too high, therefore remedial education is extremely effective because children are simply behind. Giving them that extra attention in remedial classes is going to have a huge effect. If the curriculum is appropriately paced, adequately staged, we may not need remedial education. You can only know that if you have a fuller understanding of the political economy of the system. And I think putting those two things together is really vital. This is an essential piece of information in which everything is condensed into one place for a policymaker. But what does he or she need alongside that, I think, is the question that we need to address as well.
My next question, Sally, on how do you, in fact, Caine, you've already given us some pointers on how we might make sure that this is used judiciously. But from your point of view, from the DFID's point of view, how would any advice, especially for those of us in the business of producing this kind of evidence, of what we might do to help that along?
No, sure. I mean, first of all, I think, just to support what Caine was saying, actually, about the use of this and the judicious use of this. I mean, we've actually already had conversations with Birte about how to make this more accessible, so how people can actually get into the big report rather than just pick up the short one, because there is dangers in just picking up the short one. I mean, it's important to have it, but I think there's also what's so rich here is this process stuff and why, and that's what's really helpful for people. So I think that's really important to say. So, I mean, in terms of using, I mean, for me, I think there's an image, there's a sort of a policymaker with a halo on their head who, has all the time in their world to be self-reflective and seek out evidence and has no political pressures and has no unconscious bias. And then there's a sort of reality, which may well be my unconscious bias because it's based on my own experience, which is pretty much talks too much rather than listens, doesn't have much time to seek out evidence, and is quite politically driven in terms of decision making and clearly needs things quickly. And I think it's about, I mean, this is not rocket science, it's not profound, but I do think that we do need to understand more about behaviour change and what actually, how education decision makers, how and why they make certain decisions in certain contexts. Because otherwise we will keep on doing some, and the evidence is getting better and more robust as we move along, but the use of it is clearly the most important thing. So I do feel, time well spent in understanding, how and why decision makers in the education sector use data and what has worked would be a really valuable use of somebody's time. If it's not been done already, sorry, please tell me if it has.
Thanks. No, Dave, I mean, Sally just mentioned that we really have to understand how the different stakeholders who might use this really operate and what is the right time for them to use this. You and I both have WorldMIC experience. Do you see this, where would you see this fitting into the, say, project cycle at the bank in terms of where it might be useful at all?
Yeah, no, thank you. So first, I'll just say, I mean, this is already in use. Like Manny said, I'm working on the World Development Report for education, and as we look at the evidence that we have for different kinds of interventions, the full version of this report, which we've already had access to, has been and continues to be an important input to that work. So, that's already in action. But when we think about the project cycle, like Manny said, I think that comes back to, even though, like Sally said, we don't have a lot of evidence for, I think, in education for exactly how research gets into policy. In health, people have actually done quite a bit of research on this. And a lot of it really comes down to relationships, which is not surprising. People are unlikely, and it is, I guess, sad for me to, set their policy based on some inspiring tweet that they see. But rather, they have people that they work with and who they trust. And when those people bring evidence to their attention, they pay attention to that evidence. And so when you're an organization like the World Bank, those people are the project teams who have developed relationships over time with the Malawian Ministry of Education, the Bolivian Ministry of Education, et cetera. One of the keys for getting this kind of evidence used for them, I believe, is targeting the evidence that's shared. Most of the governments that we work with, they already have a sense of what they want to do broadly. They know that they want to do an information technology intervention, but they're not sure which one. They know they need to amp up the quality of their pedagogical support, but they don't know exactly how. Very few are operating on kind of a blank slate where they say, oh, well, how do we improve learning? And so that's where I feel like subsets of this evidence that say, okay, in those spaces where we already have a space which has been ring-fenced that says, all right, the government really wants to do something on information technology. Well, let's make sure that they do the best information technology intervention they have. Governments spend millions and millions of dollars on teacher professional development every year. Well, let's make sure that those development programs are focused on these highly effective pedagogical, structured pedagogy programs. And the way to do that, I think, is to deliver a series of smaller reports that actually focus on these particular sub-areas. There's a place for each of those conversations, the big one and the small one. Most of my policy conversations have been in that smaller space.
Thanks. Just heads up to the audience, we'll be turning it over to you for questions, and after I give Caine a couple of more, I pose one more question to him. So please keep that handy, and then we'll take groups of questions. So Caine, you posed a pretty tough challenge with your remarks on making sure that this evidence is being used judiciously. In your experience as a researcher, are there policymakers out there with the halos that Sally talked about who can use this, and what can we as researchers do to help this along?
I think there are more or less policymakers with halos, but probably mostly less in the countries I've been to. But I think that what they're often thinking about is not, as Dave said, it's not an atomistic selection of interventions, but rather a route which is appropriate in that context. And so how do you select interventions at particular stages or particular phases of trajectory that an education system is in under certain kinds of constraints and conditions? And this document provides about half of the information you need for that, and the other part can't be fulfilled so easily with a generic document. It has to be read in context, in line with the experience the country has. But I think that we are learning more, and there are initiatives to do that. For example, the DFID's RISE project, which is looking at development of education systems and what are the routes from A to B. I mean, countries which have reached a middle stage of development, a higher stage, or a lower stage, there are different packages of interventions they can follow. And in fact, there are many routes to the same destination, which is perhaps one of the things that makes this kind of research quite complex. There are more than one way, for example, to reach the same improvement in test scores or the same effect of a textbook change. There are many routes. But I think putting that together, the policymaker has to be an active part of that process.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that we have the ingredients, but the recipes have to be written in tandem with the policymakers.
Yeah.
Okay, great.